Mr. President, our founders did not give us a perfect nation. Even they knew that. When Thomas Jefferson, himself a slave owner, reflected on the existence of slavery in a nation which claimed to believe that all men are created equal, he wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." Jefferson was not alone as a slave owner. George Washington, the namesake of this great city and another great state, the father of our nation, he and his wife owned 300 slaves. Just minutes before he died, he asked his wife to bring the 2 copies of his last will for him to look at for one last time and to decide. He handed one of the copies of the wills to his wife and said, "Burn this one, keep the other." The one he burned would have released all of his slaves at the moment of his death. The one he signed said that they would continue to be his wife's slaves for as long as she lived. He was the father of our nation. We might not have had an independent nation without his skill and leadership. And yet, he was not a perfect man by any means. The true measure of a nation's greatness is not simply the words written by an earlier generation. It is the work of every generation to make those words not just ideals, but facts. We see that work all around us today. For weeks, Americans have joined together in an incredible display of constitutional petitioning of this government, of this nation, for change. In cities large and small, and virtually every state, they are protesting systemic racism and police violence against people of color. These protests have spread around the world. Videotapes and DNA evidence have done more to assault the foundation of justice in America than anything in our history. In the midst of a pandemic caused by a new virus, a multi-ethnic, multi-generational alliance seems to have found a collective will to confront one of humanity's oldest viruses, the virus of racism. It was a different protest 51 years ago this month that began one of the newest chapters in America's long struggle for equal rights. That protest is the reason that June is celebrated as Pride Month. It started in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, a section of New York City. Today, the name Stonewall stands as a milestone on America's journey toward equal justice, alongside such revered names as Selma and Seneca Falls. In 1969, however, the Stonewall Inn was a ramshackle refuge for outcasts, a home away from home for some of the poorest, most powerless members within one of America's most marginalized communities. Its patrons included drag queens and lesbians, transgender and gender nonconforming people, homeless LGBTQ youth who lived in nearby Christopher Street Park after being abandoned by their own families. Police raids and arrests were regular events at the Stonewall Inn, as they were at most gay bars in America at that time. But something changed during that raid in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969. Something in this great universe shifted. That night, when the police became violent, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn fought back. The Stonewall Uprising was a 6-day protest against police mistreatment. And while the protests were contained almost entirely with Greenwich Village, they changed the world. On the first anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, the first gay pride parade was held in New York, in Los Angeles, and in the city of Chicago. Within 2 years of that uprising, there were gay rights organizations in every major city in the United States and Canada, Australia, and Western Europe. The month of June is now recognized throughout much of the world as Pride Month, a celebration of diversity, acceptance, and inclusion. Last year, on the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, the Grand Marshal leading Chicago's Pride Parade was our city's first openly gay mayor, Lori Lightfoot, an incredible leader. This year, most pride parades and festivals in the U.S. and around the globe were canceled or transformed into virtual celebrations because of COVID-19. But those virtual gatherings still had much to celebrate. We've witnessed profound progress in a half-century since Stonewall. Public attitudes about gay and trans rights have increased greatly. Marriage equality is now the law of the land. Openly gay men and women serve as corporate and civic leaders, as mayors, governors, members of Congress, and an openly gay married man just ran a serious campaign for president. Gay men and lesbians serve openly in America's armed forces. And while this generation has regrettably reinstated a ban on transgender persons serving openly in the military, trans men, women, and children are becoming more visible members of much of the rest of our society. This June also brings a major new cause for celebration. In a landmark 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is prohibited under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is an amazing story in history, where an ultra-conservative congressman from Virginia in 1964 thought that he would torpedo the Civil Rights Bill by adding the word sex into those bases for discrimination, thus inviting protection for women. He was sure that would be the end of the conversation. His amendment was adopted and, of course, led to a lot of debate on gender equality and ending gender discrimination. Little did he know, or many others, that it would lead to this historic Supreme Court ruling when it came to sexual orientation. This is history happening before our eyes, and thank goodness we're alive to see it. But work of equal justice under law is never finished. We were reminded of that last week when the Trump administration released a discriminatory rule that attempts to eliminate explicit health care protections for LGBTQ Americans. And we are reminded that the work of equality is not finished each time we learn of another victim of alarming violence against Black transgender women, including the deaths of 25-year-old Rhea Milton in Ohio and 27-year-old Dominique Remy Fells in Philadelphia. On May 29th, 4 days after George Floyd's murder, more than 100 of the nation's most prominent LGBTQ civil rights groups released a letter condemning racial violence. Their letter said that violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people of color happens, quote, with such regularity it is no exaggeration to describe it as an epidemic of violence. The groups went on to say, we understand what it means to rise up and push back against a culture that tells us we are less than them, that our lives don't matter. Today, we join together to say Black Lives Matter and commit ourselves to the actions those words require. Among the organizations signing the pledge are the Human Rights Campaign, Equality Illinois, and the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. Nearly all Americans recognize Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech at the 1963 March on Washington. It was a great moment in America's long struggle for equal rights. But how many of us know that the organizational genius behind that great gathering was a gay Black man, Bayard Rustin? How many of us know the names Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, activists and transgender women of color, members of one of the most marginalized and victimized groups in America? They were also leaders of the Stonewall Uprising. They both continued to fight for gay and trans rights all of their lives until Marsha's death in 1992 and Sylvia's death a decade later. Years after Stonewall, Marsha P. Johnson recalled, history isn't something you look back at and say it was inevitable. History happens because people make decisions that are sometimes very impulsive and of the moment, but these moments are cumulative realities. James Baldwin, a brilliant writer, thinker, gay black man, warned us that, quote, nothing can be changed until it is faced. Stonewall was a tipping point. The protests today against the deaths of George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, Laquan McDonald, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and so many other black men, women, and children are, in fact, a tipping point. Let's not look away from this historic moment of change. Let the Senate join on the right side of history. Let's not let a setback, a procedural setback on the floor of the Senate, stop us from finding some common ground to move forward. Let us acknowledge the rightness of this month's Supreme Court decision and pass the Equality Act to make it plain that discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity is illegal and will not be tolerated, not just at your place of employment, but all across America in every walk of life. And let us act to end state-sanctioned violence and oppression against our black and brown brothers and sisters. Let us do our part in our time to make the noble promises of our founders real for all Americans.